You see this massive headline number, right? India's economy is absolutely booming. It's this incredible growth story that has the whole world watching. But what if that number is only telling us part of the story? Or maybe, just maybe, a different story altogether. Today, we're diving deep into the paradox right at the heart of India's economic data.
So, this is the central question. It's what has economists, policymakers, and even the International Monetary Fund scratching their heads and asking some pretty tough questions. And you know what? The answer is nowhere near as simple as just a single number. Okay, let's get right to the core of the issue. On one hand, you have the government announcing a fantastic 8.2% GDP growth for the July to September quarter. Amazing, right? But then, almost right after, this other number pops up. Industrial growth for October was a tiny 0.3%. I mean, how can both of these things possibly be true at the same time?
So to get to the bottom of this, we're going to break it all down. We'll start with those two numbers, then look at a pretty serious warning from a global watchdog, dig into how GDP is even calculated, uncover a huge part of the economy that's basically invisible, touch on the politics behind it all, and finally, see what might be coming next.
All right, first up, let's just focus on that initial contradiction, because honestly, it's the perfect snapshot of the entire problem.
I mean, just look at this. The visual gap is, wow, it's jarring. An 8.2% growth rate makes you think of a roaring economy, right? Factories buzzing, tons of activity. But 0.3% for industrial growth, that paints a picture of an economy that's pretty much at a standstill. They just can't both be telling an accurate story.
And you know, it's not just a few analysts pointing this out. Not long ago, one of the world's most important financial institutions raised a major red flag.
That is a direct quote from the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. Now, when an organization that basically acts as the world's economic watchdog says your official numbers are not fit for purpose, that's a really big deal. It's not just saying the data is a little off, it's saying it's fundamentally flawed, both for them and for India's own policymakers.
So what were the IMF's specific problems? Well, they pointed to a few key things. For one, the data is based on a 2011-12 baseline. That's over a decade old. There are also big gaps and weird inconsistencies in the numbers. And crucially, they highlighted a technical flaw in how inflation is calculated. And to top it all off, data from states and local governments hasn't even been updated since 2019.
Now, one of the IMF's biggest technical points was on this thing called double deflation. It sounds super complicated, I know, but the basic idea is actually quite simple, and it's incredibly important if you want to get an accurate number.
Think of it this way. To figure out the real value a company adds, you have to look at what it sells, its output, and what it buys to make those things, its inputs. Now, what if the price of raw materials goes up way faster than the price of the final product? Well, the real value you've added actually shrinks. Double deflation accounts for this by adjusting both sides for inflation separately. India's current method doesn't really do this, and that can seriously warp the final growth number.
The IMF's warning is pretty recent, but critics argue the real root of the problem goes all the way back to a major statistical change that was made back in 2015.
The controversy around this GDP series started almost the minute it was launched in 2015. Problems popped up right away. A committee calculated historical data to compare the new method to the old one, but the government rejected it, allegedly because it showed lower growth. Then, a former top government economist came out and said he estimated the numbers were being inflated by up to 3 percentage points. And maybe the strangest thing of all? When 300,000 fake or shell companies were removed from the database, the GDP figures didn't even budge.
All of this brings us to what might be the single biggest issue with the data, a massive, absolutely vital part of the Indian economy that the official numbers just can't see properly.
Just take a look at this. It's pretty staggering. Only a tiny 6% of workers are in what we'd call the organized or formal sector, big corporations. A whopping 94% work in the unorganized sector. We're talking about small neighborhood shops, farmers, daily wage laborers, street vendors. This isn't some small slice of the economy. For the vast majority of people, this is the Indian economy.
Okay, so here's the crucial point. There's no reliable, regular data for that massive 94% of the economy. So, to figure out the quarterly GDP, statisticians use a shortcut. They take the growth rate of the formal corporate sector, and they just assume the informal sector is growing at the exact same pace.
But here is where that assumption completely falls apart. The organized and unorganized sectors have had wildly different experiences over the past decade. The formal sector has often adapted, automated, and even grown, while the informal sector has just been battered by one economic shock after another.
Let's just run through these shocks. First, demonetization in 2016. That move to invalidate most of the country's cash basically wiped out small cash-reliant businesses overnight. Then came the GST rollout in 2017. This new tax system gave formal businesses a huge advantage over informal ones. And of course, the pandemic in 2020 was just devastating for the unorganized sector. And through all of this, the official method kept on assuming the struggling sector was growing just like the big corporation.
So, this faulty shortcut has a massive impact. Because you're using a rising sector to measure a declining one, economists estimate that the final GDP number is being overestimated by 3 to 4 percentage points. Think about that. A reported growth of 7% could, in reality, be closer to 3%. And that gap has huge consequences, because a government making policy for a booming economy is very different from one making policy for a struggling one.
You know, this whole GDP issue isn't some isolated incident. Critics point to a broader pattern where inconvenient economic data has been either suppressed or delayed.
For example, a major survey that showed consumer spending was actually falling was withheld by the government. A report showing unemployment had hit a 45-year high was delayed until after an election. And the national census, which is the bedrock of all statistical surveys, has been postponed indefinitely. This pattern has led to accusations that data is being managed to keep up a positive economic story.
So with all these known issues, is there any hope for a fix? What does the future of India's economic data actually look like?
Well, there is a potential reboot on the horizon. The government has scheduled a completely new GDP and price index series for release in early 2026, and that could address a lot of these methodological problems. However, there's a huge catch. The national census, last done in 2011, is the foundation for every other survey. Without an up-to-date census to give a proper map of the country's people and economy, any new survey built on that old foundation risks being inaccurate from the day it's released.
And this really leaves us with a fundamental question. GDP figures aren't just stats on a page. They influence investment, they guide policy, and they shape a nation's story about itself. So what happens to policy, to investment, and to reality itself when the official story and the numbers it's built on come under question?